Welcome back to Lina's Romantasy collection, where the magic is raw and the Lycan Kings always take what belongs to them. Quick question for the collection before we unleash today's chaos. Where are you listening from right now? Let me know in the comments and drop a mouse or a pink heart emoji if you have a pet that, just like our little friend Nibs, has absolutely zero respect for your personal boundaries. Today, we have a wild one. It's chaotic, it's breathtakingly steamy, and it involves a rogue truth spell that turns a royal wedding into a total disaster zone. But before we start, if you want to support the channel and get early access to stories like this, hit that join button down below. It helps us keep the magic alive and the stories coming. Now, take a deep breath and steady your feet. The truth is out, the king is feral, and the earth is about to move. Let's read. Chapter 1. The bell above the shop door didn't just ring. It shrieked like a ghost in pain as the heavy wood slammed against the stone wall. The draft pulled a cloud of dust from the floor, swirling it into the dim light of the shop. Juno stood behind the counter, her fingers stained with the juice of crushed herbs. She didn't look up. She knew that scent. It wasn't the smell of a normal customer. It was the scent of cedar and steel, thick enough to choke the air out of the small room. Gideon marched inside. He didn't saunter. He didn't wait for a greeting. He moved like a storm front that owned the sky. His dark, tailored suit strained against his shoulders. He stopped at the counter, his presence turning the cramped shop into a cage. He looked at the jars of dried roots and the bundles of sage with a sneer that made Juno's blood simmer. "Fix this," Gideon barked. He didn't place the item down. He dropped it. A heavy iron signet ring hit the wood with a dull thud and rolled toward Juno's hand. She watched it wobble before it came to a stop. The metal felt cold even from a distance. Juno wiped her hands on her tan canvas jacket. She looked at the ring, then up at the man. Gideon's eyes were hard, like flint waiting for a spark. A jagged scar ran from his jaw down to his collar, a white line against his tan skin. He looked like a man who had never heard the word no in his life. "The binding charm is trash," Gideon said. His voice was a low rumble that made the glass jars on the shelves rattle. "It flickers when I shift. My bride needs a gift that holds its power, not some street magic junk." Juno reached into the pocket of her jacket. Her fingers brushed against a small glass vial. The truth dust felt warm through the glass. She took a breath. The shop smelled of mint and rain, a scent that usually calmed her. Today, it felt like fuel. "You've got a lot of nerve, Gideon," Juno said. She didn't use his title. She didn't bow. "You come in here, kick my door, and insult my craft. If the charm is flickering, it's because your wolf is too stunted to feed it." The air in the room snapped. Gideon leaned over the counter. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He slammed his right hand onto the wood next to the ring. The signet ring he already wore tapped against the counter, a sharp, rhythmic sound. "Watch your tongue, witch," Gideon growled. "I have enough gold in my car to buy this entire block and burn it for heat. Do your job or I'll find someone who can." Juno's jaw tightened. She didn't fear him. She hated him. She hated the way he thought everything had a price. She hated the way he looked at her like she was a bug under a boot. "Oh, I'll do my job," Juno whispered. She didn't grab the ring. Instead, she pulled the vial from her pocket. With a flick of her thumb, she popped the cork. She didn't wait. She threw the silver powder right into his face. Gideon didn't flinch in time. He inhaled as he started to shout. The dust flared bright silver in the air, coating his throat and chest. He coughed, his hand flying to his neck as the glow sank into his skin. For a heartbeat, his eyes flashed a bright, predatory amber. "What did you do?" he hissed. His voice sounded different. It had a sharp, metallic edge to it. "I gave you a gift," Juno said. She tucked the empty vial back into her satchel. "Consider it a wedding present. You won't be able to say anything but the truth for a week. Let's see how your bride likes the real you." Gideon reached across the counter, his fingers curling like claws. He grabbed Juno by the front of her canvas jacket and pulled her forward. The movement was fast, a blur of strength. Juno's boots left the floor. "Undo it," he commanded. Nibs, the white mouse, scrambled out of Juno's satchel and perched on her shoulder. The mouse's fur began to shift, a crimson tint bleeding through the white hairs. Nibs let out a tiny, fierce hiss at the king. Gideon glanced at the mouse, then back at Juno. He let out a breath that smelled of winter. He shoved her back, and she hit the shelves behind her. Glass jars clinked and shifted, but nothing broke. "I'll be back for the cure," Gideon said. He grabbed his ring from the counter. "And when I come back, I'll take more than just an apology." He turned on his heel and walked out. The door, already strained from his entrance, hung crooked on its top hinge. It wouldn't close now. The cold wind from the street rushed in, carrying the sound of a high-performance engine roaring to life. The plum-colored sports car screamed as it tore away from the curb. Juno stood in the silence, her heart thumping against her ribs. She looked at the broken door and then at Nibs. The mouse was still red, vibrating with shared anger. "We're in trouble, Nibs," she whispered. Chapter 2. The shop stayed cold. Juno tried to pull the door shut, but the wood groaned and stuck against the stone frame. The top hinge was bent into a jagged U shape. She'd need a hammer and a new set of screws to fix it, and she had neither. She pushed a heavy display case in front of the gap to keep the stray cats out, then slumped against the counter. Nibs hopped down from her shoulder and scurried across the wood. He wasn't red anymore. He was a bright, curious orange. He moved toward the spot where Gideon had slammed his hand. The mouse paused, sniffing the air, then dived under a stack of old leather-bound ledgers. "Come out of there, Nibs," Juno said. She reached for her leather satchel and began to check her supplies. The vial of truth dust was gone, and she knew she didn't have the ingredients to make more. The silver root required for the base only grew in the deep caves of the Lycan territory. Nibs reappeared, dragging something heavy. He squeaked, his tiny paws slipping on the polished wood. Juno leaned in. "What did you find?" It was a gold button. It was thick, heavy, and embossed with a wolf's head. The edges were sharp and clean. It must have popped off Gideon's cuff when he grabbed her jacket. Juno picked it up. The weight of it felt wrong in her hand. It felt like a debt. "You thief," Juno said, though a small smile tugged at her mouth. "If he finds out you have this, he'll turn you into a snack." Nibs sat up on his hind legs and twitched his nose. He looked proud. He began to groom his whiskers, his fur shifting from orange to a soft, shimmering pink. Juno froze. She looked at the mouse. "Why are you pink? There's nothing to be attracted to here, Nibs. It's just us and a broken door." The mouse ignored her and started to gnaw on a piece of dried apple he found near the scales. Juno looked back at the gold button. The Lycan King was a monster, but he was a monster with a very expensive car and a very dangerous presence. She tucked the button into the inner pocket of her jacket, right next to where the vial had been. She spent the next hour checking her shelves. She needed to know exactly what she had left. She found 3 bundles of dried lavender, a jar of salt, and a small pouch of iron filings. Nothing that could stop a king. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. The truth dust she had used wasn't the standard grade. It was the batch she had brewed using the primal earth essence she usually kept hidden. It wasn't just a truth spell, it was a soul binder. It didn't just force words, it forced the heart to reveal its deepest hungers. "I messed up," Juno muttered. She walked to the back of the shop where a small sink sat tucked into the corner. She splashed cold water on her face. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed a woman who looked tired. Her dark hair was a mess, escaping the leather cord. The wedding was tomorrow. Sloane, the High Witch of the South Coven, was set to marry Gideon to seal the treaty. Sloane was a woman who used power like a whip. If Gideon stood at that altar and spoke his true thoughts about the coven, the peace would shatter. The witches would hunt Juno down for sabotaging the union. She had to get to the wedding. She had to see if the spell held, or if she needed to find a way to damp the magic before the whole world went up in flames. Juno grabbed her leather satchel and checked the strap. It was sturdy. She packed a small knife, her pouch of salt, and the gold button. "We're going to a party, Nibs," she said. The mouse hopped into her pocket, his fur still a stubborn shade of pink. Chapter 3. The royal courtyard was a sea of white lilies and sharp edges. The stone walls of the temple rose up toward the gray sky, looking more like a fortress than a place of worship. Guards in dark suits stood every 10 feet, their eyes scanning the crowd. They weren't looking for assassins, they were looking for any sign of disrespect. Juno moved through the crowd, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. She had ditched her canvas jacket for a simple, dark cloak she'd found in the back of her closet. It smelled of cedar, a lingering reminder of the king's visit to her shop. She kept her hood up and her head down. In her pocket, Nibs was restless. He kept poking his head out to look at the decorations. He was bright orange now, sensing the lies that filled the air. This place was a hive of them. Every smile from a duchess and every nod from a general felt fake. Then, the bells began to chime. The crowd went silent. At the front of the courtyard, the temple doors swung open. Sloane stepped out. She was a vision of cold steel wrapped in deep violet silk. The dress was stiff, the collar rising up to her chin like a fence. Her hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful. She didn't look like a bride, she looked like a conqueror. She held a bouquet of dark roses that looked like they were made of velvet. Juno watched her walk down the aisle toward the altar. Sloane's eyes were fixed on the man waiting for her. Gideon stood on the stone platform. He wore a black suit that looked like armor. The scar on his jaw seemed more prominent in the daylight. He didn't look at Sloane with love. He looked at her like a task he needed to finish. As Sloane reached the altar, the high priest stepped forward. He held a staff made of twisted oak and silver. Gideon stiffened. Juno could see the faint, silver glow beginning to pulse around his throat. It was faint, invisible to anyone without magic, but to her, it was a beacon. "The binding of blood and bone," the priest intoned. His voice carried across the silent courtyard. Juno gripped the strap of her satchel. She was standing near a stone pillar, hidden by the shadows of a large urn. She could feel the earth beneath the stone tiles, a humming energy that waited for her call. But she couldn't use it. Not here. Gideon's hand went to his throat. He looked uncomfortable. He shifted his weight, his iron signet ring catching the light. Sloane took his hand. Her fingers, long and thin, curled around his. She leaned in, a small, triumphant smile on her lips. She whispered something only he could hear. Gideon didn't smile back. He looked like he wanted to bite someone. "We are gathered to witness the union of the Lycan King and the daughter of the Coven," the priest continued. "A union of peace, a union of truth." Juno nearly laughed. The irony was a weight in her lungs. Nibs poked his head out of her pocket and let out a tiny sneeze. The mouse's fur was vibrating between orange and pink, a chaotic mix of colors that made Juno's stomach turn. "Do you, Gideon of the Great North, take this woman to be your queen? Do you vow to protect the coven and speak only of the bond you share?" The silver glow around Gideon's neck flared bright. It looked like a collar of liquid moonlight. He opened his mouth to give the scripted answer. He tried to say the words written for him by the council, but the truth dust didn't care about scripts. Chapter 4. Gideon's jaw worked, his muscles corded with the effort of fighting the spell. The silence in the courtyard stretched until it became a physical thing, a cord stretched to the point of snapping. Sloane's smile wavered. She squeezed his hand, her knuckles turning white. "Gideon?" she prompted, her voice a sharp blade. Gideon took a breath. He looked down at Sloane. The amber in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, clear gray. "I take no vow that binds me to a snake," Gideon said. His voice wasn't a roar. It was a calm, steady fact. The sound of it hit the crowd like a wave of ice water. The priest froze, his staff trembling in his hand. "Gideon, stop this madness!" Sloane hissed. She stepped closer, her violet silk rustling. "The treaty!" "The treaty is a leash held by a vulture," Gideon said. He looked at the priest, then back at the woman in front of him. "You have the charm of a dead rat, Sloane. Your breath smells of rot and ambition. I would rather spend my life in a silver cage than spend a single night in your bed." The gasp from the crowd was a collective roar. Sloane recoiled as if he had struck her. Her face went from pale to a mottled, angry red. She reached into her sleeve, her hand closing around the silver dagger she kept hidden there. "You dare!" she screamed. Gideon didn't flinch. He let go of her hand and stepped back. "I dare because I cannot say otherwise. You are a plague on my people, and I find the thought of touching you to be a chore I no longer wish to perform." He turned his back on her, a move of utter disrespect. He scanned the crowd. His gaze moved past the lords and ladies, past the guards, and locked onto the stone pillar where Juno was hiding. The silver glow on his neck was blinding now. He didn't look angry. He looked focused. He moved off the platform, shoving a duke out of his way with a single hand. He marched down the aisle, the crowd parting for him like he was a scythe through wheat. Juno tried to move, but her feet felt like they were rooted into the stone. Gideon stopped right in front of her. He was a mountain of a man, blocking out the sun. He reached out and grabbed her by the waist, his hand large enough to span half her torso. With a single, powerful pull, he hauled her out of the shadows and toward the altar. "Who is this?" the priest cried out, his voice cracking. Gideon didn't answer the priest. He pinned Juno back against the cold marble of the altar. He slammed his hands down on the stone on either side of her head, trapping her. The scent of cedar and steel washed over her, making her dizzy. "Gideon, let go!" Juno whispered. Her hands came up to push against his chest, her fingers tangling in the fine fabric of his suit. Nibs scrambled out of her pocket and stood on the marble next to Gideon's hand. The mouse was shimmering, neon pink. He looked like a tiny, glowing beacon of desire. Gideon looked at the mouse, then down at Juno. His face was inches from hers. He could see the fear in her eyes, and she could see the raw, unfiltered truth in his. "I don't want the witch in violet," Gideon said, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard. "I want you. I've wanted you since you threw that dust in my face. I want the mint and the rain and the fire in your tongue." Sloane let out a scream of pure rage. She raised her silver dagger, the metal gleaming with a deadly light. "I will kill her!" Gideon didn't even look back at her. He kept his eyes on Juno. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. "Run with me," he whispered, "or I'll carry you. Either way, you're mine." He didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed Juno's hand, his fingers locking with hers, and turned to face the chaos he had created. Chapter 5. Sloane's face contorted into a mask of pure fury. The stiff, violet silk of her gown rustled like dry leaves as she lunged across the marble. She thrust the silver dagger forward, aiming the toxic blade straight for Gideon's ribs. Gideon's survival instincts flared. Silver meant a slow, burning agony that stalled his healing and poisoned his blood. He dropped his hands from the altar and grabbed Juno by the shoulders, yanking her backward. The silver dagger missed his dark suit jacket by a mere inch and slammed into the stone altar. The impact sent a harsh shriek echoing through the courtyard and left a jagged, deep groove in the pristine marble. "Take her!" Sloane shrieked, pointing her free hand at Juno. Temple guards surged forward, drawing heavy, iron-tipped batons. Gideon stepped in front of Juno, forming a wall of muscle and wool between her and the attackers. He didn't shift into his wolf form. He needed his clothes intact, and he needed his hands free to hold on to Juno. He grabbed the nearest guard by the thick collar of his coat, lifted the man off his boots, and hurled him into a cluster of high priests. They crashed to the floor in a tangled, groaning heap of robes and limbs. Juno's hand dived into her worn leather satchel. Her fingers brushed past the small pouch of salt, her pocket knife, and the torn gold button. She needed a weapon, but the courtyard floor was solid stone, too thick for her earth magic to break without exposing her true power to the entire world. Nibs poked his head out of the satchel. The mouse was glowing a frantic neon pink. He let out a sharp squeak as a stray defensive spell, a crackling orb of green light, blasted a floral arrangement nearby. Smashed white lilies and smoking stems rained down on them. Gideon's throat pulsed with the pearlescent glow of the moon ash hex. The dust forced his next words into the open air. This coven demands loyalty, yet your high witch feeds on the power of her own acolytes. I smell the stolen magic on her skin. I refuse to bind my territory to a parasite. The accusation dropped like a falling anvil. The nobles froze. Sloane's eyes widened in stark terror. The Truth Hex turned whispered rumors into undeniable facts. Gideon used the stunned silence. He grabbed Juno's wrist. His grip was iron. "Move," he commanded. They sprinted down the center aisle. Juno's dark cloak snapped behind her. Her boots crushed the scattered flower petals, sliding on the slick marble tiles. A guard stepped into their path, raising his baton. Gideon didn't even break his stride. He threw a harsh right hook. His heavy iron signet ring connected with the guard's jaw, resulting in a loud crack that echoed over the courtyard. The man crumpled to the floor. They reached the heavy oak doors of the temple. Gideon shoved them open with his shoulder, breaking the latch. The cold wind of the city hit Juno's face. She glanced back. Sloane stood by the ruined altar, her violet dress a stain against the white stone, the silver dagger still gripped in her fist. The High Witch's face promised absolute war. "Keep your eyes forward," Gideon ordered, pulling her down the stone steps. Chapter 6. They emerged from the temple grounds and hit the city streets. The alarm bells began to ring, a frantic, offbeat rhythm that signaled an attack. Gideon wove through the panicked crowd, dragging Juno past fruit stands and merchant carts. A wooden cart tipped over, spilling bright red apples across the cobblestones. Juno jumped over the rolling fruit, her breath burning in her lungs. She kept one hand clamped firmly over her leather satchel to make sure nibs didn't bounce out. They darted into a narrow alleyway. Gideon's custom plum-colored sports car sat parked at the curb, a sleek machine of low-slung metal and dark-tinted glass. The engine housing looked like a caged beast. Gideon tossed a key fob in his palm. The locks clicked open with a sharp clack. Juno slid into the passenger seat. The interior smelled of expensive leather and the faint trace of cedar. She dropped her satchel into her lap. Nibs climbed out, his pink fur fading back to snow white as the immediate danger passed. The mouse sniffed the dashboard, then settled next to an air vent. Gideon slid behind the wheel and hit the ignition. The engine roared to life, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the floorboards. He slammed the gear shift and hit the gas. The plum-colored car tore away from the curb, leaving a cloud of tire smoke in its wake. The acceleration pushed Juno back into the bucket seat. The cityscape blurs past the windows as Gideon navigated the winding streets with lethal precision. "They will track us," Juno said, watching the rearview mirror. "Sloane has enough trackers in her coven to find a needle in a haystack." "They can try," Gideon said, taking a sharp corner. The tires squealed in protest. "My stronghold sits in the jagged mountains. The wards repel unauthorized magic. Once we cross the boundary line, Sloane's scrying pools will show nothing but static." Juno gripped the armrest. "And what happens to me? You bring me to your fortress and then what? Lock me in a dungeon?" The pearlescent glow flashed under Gideon's collar. The Truth Hex demanded an answer. He kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. "I have no dungeons. I intend to put you in my guest wing. I intend to keep you close until this hex burns out of my blood. And every time I look at your mouth, I think about pulling this car over and finding out if you taste like the mint you smell like." Juno's face burned hot. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. Near the air vent, Nibs instantly turned a vibrant, shimmering pink. The mouse let out a tiny, high-pitched chirp and started grooming its whiskers. Gideon caught the pink glow in his peripheral vision. A dark chuckle rumbled in his chest. "Your rat agrees with me." "He is a mouse," Juno said, her voice strained, "and he has boundary issues." "He has good taste," Gideon replied. The car left the city limits, hitting the open highway. The landscape changed from towering brick buildings to dense, dark forests. The road began to incline, winding up into the treacherous mountain passes. Juno reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the gold button. She traced the raised edge of the wolf's head in silence as the sky darkened to pitch black. Chapter 7. The plum-colored car devoured the miles until the trees broke, revealing a massive structure carved straight into the side of a jagged peak. High stone walls, iron gates, and a distinct lack of welcome marked the territory. Two massive wolves, their fur the color of midnight, stood guard. They bowed their heads at the approaching car. The iron gates ground open, and Gideon drove into the courtyard, killing the engine. Gideon stepped out. The mountain air was biting cold, carrying the scent of pine and crushed ice. Juno followed, shivering as the wind cut through her dark cloak. She pulled the fabric tighter around her shoulders, gripping her leather satchel. The stronghold looked ancient on the outside, but the interior told a different story. The great hall featured vaulted ceilings, polished slate floors, and modern lighting fixtures that cast a warm glow over dark wood furniture. A man in combat gear stepped from the shadows. A thick scar crossed his left eye. "My king," he said, bowing slightly. "The wedding?" "Cancelled," Gideon replied flatly. "Lock down the perimeter. Double the guard on the southern ridge. Witches will probe our defenses by morning." The guard nodded and disappeared down a hallway. "Come," Gideon ordered Juno. He led her up a sweeping staircase and down a quiet corridor. He opened a heavy oak door and gestured for her to enter. The room was vast. A large bed sat in the center, covered in thick furs. Large windows overlooked the sheer drop of the mountain. On the far wall, a wide, modern gas fireplace waited in the stone hearth. Juno walked in, her boots clicking on the slate floor. The room felt freezing. She spotted a switch on the wall next to the hearth and flipped it. The gas fireplace clicked, a sharp mechanical sound, and a perfect line of blue-orange flames erupted from the burner. It provided instant heat, but it lacked a soul. There were no logs, no ash, and no embers to die down. It could not be stoked with a poker, it just burned steadily. Gideon stepped inside and closed the door. He leaned against the wood, crossing his arms. His tailored suit looked battered, the right cuff missing its gold button. "This is my room," Gideon stated. Juno spun around. "You said I was going to the guest wing." The pearlescent glow flashed on his neck. "I lied, or rather I planned to, but the hex caught the intent. You are staying here, where my guards know you are under my direct protection." Juno stepped back, the heat of the gas fire warming her spine. "You think I need your protection?" "Sloane will send assassins. If they breach the walls, I want you behind me," Gideon said. He took a step forward, the sheer size of him making the large room shrink. "And I want you in my bed." Nibs poked his head out of the satchel. The mouse took one look at Gideon, listened to the tension in the room, and turned a brilliant, glowing pink. The color illuminated the inside of Juno's bag like a tiny neon sign. Gideon tapped his heavy iron signet ring against the wooden doorframe. Tap, tap, tap. A dangerous smirk spread across his face. "Your familiar gives you away, Juno. You act like you despise me, but your little rat says otherwise." "He is broken," Juno lied, her voice shaking slightly. Instantly, Nibs's fur shifted from pink to a blaring bright orange. The lie detector worked perfectly. Gideon laughed, a rich, dark sound. "He works perfectly. Get some sleep, witch. Tomorrow we figure out how to keep you alive." Chapter 8. Miles Away. Back in the heart of the city, the temple courtyard sat empty. The broken marble altar stood as a silent testament to the ruined day. Sloane paced the length of the High Council chamber. The circular room was built from dark obsidian and lined with silver sconces. The violet silk of her gown dragged along the floor, the hem torn and dirty from the frantic aftermath of the escape. She still clutched the silver dagger, her knuckles white from the force of her grip. Seated around a large circular table were the 5 elders of the coven. They wore gray robes, their faces hidden in the shadows of heavy hoods. They watched Sloane with cold, calculating eyes. "He humiliated us," Sloane hissed. She slammed her hands down on the polished wood of the table. "He broke the treaty in front of the dukes, the generals, and the lower houses. We look weak." "We look like fools," the first elder corrected. Her voice sounded like grinding stones. "You allowed a street peddler to interrupt a sacred binding. Who is the girl?" Sloane's face twisted with rage. "A nobody, a rat from the lower markets. She runs a charm shop." "A charm shop peddler does not possess the power to force the Lycan King to speak out against a high witch," the second elder noted calmly. "There is magic at play. Old magic." "I don't care what kind of magic she uses," Sloane snapped. She clicked her tongue against her teeth, a sharp, angry sound that echoed in the silent room. "I want her found. I want her dragged back to this city. I want to peel the skin from her bones myself." The first elder leaned forward. The candlelight caught the intricate silver tattoos marking her face. "The king took her to his mountain stronghold. The wards there are ancient. We cannot scry inside the walls. If we march an army to his gates, we start the war we spent a century trying to prevent." "The war started the moment he threw that guard," Sloane declared. She lifted the silver dagger, the metal gleaming with a harsh, cold light. "He refused the binding. He accused us of draining our own. If we let that stand, the other covens will turn on us. We must strike first." Sloane walked around the table, her boots clicking on the obsidian floor. She stopped behind the first elder's chair. "We do not need an army. We need a scalpel. Send the Shadow Walkers. Have them breach the lower levels of the stronghold. Find the girl. Once she is dead, the king will have nothing left to protect." The elders exchanged a long, silent look. The treaty was broken. The gold and trade routes promised by the Union were lost. Retaliation remained the only path to preserve their honor. "Very well," the first elder said. "The hunt is called. The girl is marked. We will send the Shadow Walkers tonight." Sloane smiled. It was a thin, cruel expression that didn't reach her eyes. She looked down at the silver dagger in her hand. The price of this insult demanded blood, and she intended to collect every single drop. Chapter 9. The morning sun hit the mountain peaks, casting long, sharp shadows across the bedroom floor. Juno woke with a start. Her back ached from sleeping in her clothes. She had spent the night curled on the far edge of the large bed, buried under a pile of thick furs. She sat up and pushed the messy hair out of her eyes. On the far wall, the modern gas fireplace still burned. It had run all night. She walked over to the wall and hit the switch. A sharp, mechanical click echoed in the quiet room. The perfect line of blue-orange flames died in an instant, leaving behind cold stone. There were no logs, no ash, and no embers to fade, just a sterile hearth. A heavy knock rattled the oak door. The lock turned. Gideon walked in. He had traded his battered wedding suit for a dark, fitted sweater and heavy canvas trousers. He pushed a steel cart into the room. The scent of roasted meat and bitter coffee filled the air. "Eat," Gideon commanded. He pushed the cart toward the low wooden table near the window. Juno didn't move from the hearth. She kept her hands inside the pockets of her tan jacket. Her dark cloak sat draped over a nearby chair where she had abandoned it the night before. "I prefer to know if my food is poisoned." The pearlescent glow flashed beneath the collar of Gideon's sweater. The moon ash hex dragged the truth out of his throat. "I have no reason to poison you. I need you alive, and watching you starve yourself irritates me." He sat in a high-backed leather chair and poured a cup of dark coffee. He didn't offer her one. He set the pot down and began to serve himself a plate of thick-cut bacon and scrambled eggs. Juno watched him. The man ate like a soldier, efficient and focused. Her stomach let out a loud, embarrassing rumble. She crossed the room, her boots clicking against the slate floor, and sat in the chair opposite him. She grabbed a plate and loaded it with food. The meat tasted rich, cured with sharp mountain spices. Inside her worn leather satchel, a rustling noise broke the silence. Nibs poked his head out. The mouse twitched his pink nose, taking in the scent of the breakfast spread. Before Juno could stop him, the white mouse launched himself out of the bag, scurried across the table, and sank his teeth into a piece of bacon resting on the edge of Gideon's plate. Juno froze. She waited for the king to snap the small creature's neck. Gideon stopped chewing. He stared at the mouse. Nibs stared back, the bacon clamped firmly in his jaws. The mouse gave a sharp tug, trying to drag the meat away. "Your familiar has a death wish," Gideon stated. Juno reached out and scooped Nibs into her hand. She dumped him back into her satchel, bacon and all. "He gets hungry." "He steals from a king," Gideon corrected. He took a sip of his coffee. His amber eyes locked onto her face. The glow on his neck pulsed again, brighter this time. "Let the rat eat. I tolerate him because he belongs to you, and my tolerance for you stretches further than my logic allows. Every time you look at me with that defiance, I want to pull you across this table." Juno dropped her fork. The metal clattered against the ceramic plate. Her face burned hot. She looked away, staring out the large window at the sheer drop of the mountain. Inside the satchel, a bright, shimmering pink light began to spill out of the leather seams. Nibs glowed like a beacon, broadcasting her hidden reaction to the entire room. Gideon laughed. The sound rumbled deep in his chest, a dark, victorious noise. "The hex forces me to speak my mind. Your rat does the same for you. We make a balanced pair, witch." "We make a disaster," Juno shot back, grabbing the edges of her jacket. "The coven will not let this insult pass. Sloane will come for blood." Gideon tapped his heavy iron signet ring against the wooden table. Tap, tap, tap. "Let her come. My guards hold the perimeter. The walls hold the wards. You are safe here." "I am a prisoner here," Juno corrected. "For now," Gideon said, leaning forward. "But a cage only works if you want to leave. And by the time this hex breaks, I plan to make sure you want to stay." Chapter 10. Juno pushed her chair back and stood up. The air in the room felt too thick to breathe. She paced the length of the slate floor, her boots wearing a path in front of the cold gas fireplace. Gideon remained seated at the table, finishing his coffee. His eyes tracked her every movement. "You think this is a game," Juno said, spinning to face him. "I think this is a temporary inconvenience," Gideon replied. Juno narrowed her eyes. The moon ash hex ran through his blood. It forced absolute honesty. She had never possessed a weapon this sharp, and she realized she was wasting it. If he could not lie, she could ask him anything. She could strip the king bare and find every weakness in the Northern Territory. "Let us test that," Juno said. She stopped pacing and crossed her arms. "Why the wedding? If you hate the coven, why agree to marry Sloane?" Gideon set his cup down. The silver glow washed over his throat. "Trade routes. The Western Pacts face a famine. The coven controls the southern agricultural lands. Sloane offered a treaty. Food for our borders, peace for our people. I traded my freedom for grain." The blunt admission hit Juno like a physical blow. He wasn't just a tyrant, he was a leader trying to feed his people. She pushed the thought away. She needed dirt, not nobility. "Are the wards around this mountain strong enough to keep a shadow walker out?" she asked. Gideon's jaw tightened. "No magic is flawless. If a shadow walker possesses a specific scent or a personal item belonging to a target, they can slip through the outer perimeter. But they cannot survive my inner guard." They will target me, Juno said. Her pulse picked up speed. I ruined the treaty. I humiliated the High Witch in front of the nobles. Gideon stood up. The sheer size of him dominated the room. He closed the distance between them, stopping a foot away. The heat radiating from his skin combated the cold draft leaking through the window pane. They will try, and they will fail. Juno tilted her head. You sound very confident for a man missing half his political power. Ask me another question, Gideon urged. His voice dropped to a rough, gravelly pitch. You want to find my weaknesses. Dig deeper, Juno. She swallowed hard. Why did you drag me here? You could have thrown the blame on me and handed me over to Sloane at the altar. It would have saved your treaty. The pearlescent light flared bright, illuminating the jagged scar on his neck. Because handing you over meant watching you die, and I want you breathing. I want you fighting me. Ask me what I thought when I pinned you against that marble altar. Juno stepped back, her shoulders hitting the stone wall. I don't want to know. Gideon closed the gap, placing his hands flat against the stone on either side of her head. He trapped her, just like he had in the temple courtyard. I thought about the taste of your mouth. I thought about dragging you away from the crowd and finding out if you scream as loud as you fight. Inside the satchel slung across her chest, nibs erupted into a blinding neon pink. The color illuminated the canvas of her jacket. Juno's breath hitched. She tried to push against Gideon's solid chest, but her hands lingered on the dark wool of his sweater. You repulse me, Juno lied, her voice shaking. Instantly, the glow radiating from the satchel shifted to a blaring, bright orange. Gideon smirked. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. Your familiar calls you a liar. Stop hiding behind your sharp tongue. You want this chaos just as much as I do. Chapter 11. The sky outside the large windows turned the color of bruised iron. The mountain sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, plunging the stronghold into an early twilight. The tension in the bedroom hung thick, an unspoken challenge waiting for a spark. Then, a harsh, grinding horn blasted through the fortress. The sound vibrated through the slate floor and rattled the window panes. It was a high-pitched wail, frantic and unyielding. Gideon stopped smirking. He stepped back from Juno, the king taking over the man in an instant. He turned his head toward the heavy oak door, his amber eyes scanning the wood as if he could see right through it. Heavy boots pounded down the hallway outside. The lock clicked open, and the scarred guard from the night before burst into the room. The man held a drawn broadsword. He breathed hard, a streak of dirt crossing his forehead. Breach on the lower levels, the guard reported. The outer wards failed. Intruders in the catacombs. Gideon's expression turned lethal. Shadow walkers? Yes, my king. They bypassed the iron gates. They are using smoke screens to mask their numbers. Gideon crossed the room and grabbed a heavy iron blade resting on a weapon rack near the door. He tested the weight in his grip. Lock down the main hall. Send the vanguard to the armory. Isolate the lower stairwells and flood the corridors with light. They hate the fire. He turned back to Juno. His eyes were cold, calculating. Stay away from the glass. Stay away from the door. You are locking me in? Juno asked, her hands balling into fists. I am keeping you alive, Gideon corrected. He stepped out into the hall. He looked at the scarred guard. Put 2 men on this door. No one enters. If a shadow drops near this room, you end it. The guard nodded. Gideon pulled the heavy oak door shut. The brass lock clicked into place, followed by the slide of a heavy iron deadbolt. Juno heard the boots of the assigned guards take their positions in the hall. The grinding horn continued to wail. Juno stood in the center of the vast, cold room. She hated feeling useless. She walked over to her leather satchel resting on the table. She opened the flap and began to check her supplies. She pulled out her small knife. The blade was short, designed for cutting dried roots and scraping bark. It was not meant for combat. She set it on the table. Next, she pulled out the small pouch of salt. Salt disrupted minor illusions and weak spells, but a trained shadow walker would push right through it. She dug deeper, her fingers brushing against the torn gold button she had taken from the shop. She left the button in the bottom of the bag. Nibs climbed out and sat next to the knife. The mouse was no longer pink or orange. His fur turned a stark, glowing white. He sensed the impending violence. Juno paced the room. The thick rugs covering parts of the slate floor muffled her steps. She stopped near the glass windows and looked down at the courtyard far below. Torches flared to life, casting erratic shadows against the stone walls. She saw Lycan soldiers shifting forms, massive wolves tearing through the snow, hunting for the invaders. Sloane had not waited. The High Witch wanted blood, and she wanted it fast. Juno gripped the edge of the windowsill. The glass felt like ice against her skin. She needed a better weapon. She needed ground. She looked down at the floor. The polished slate tiles covered the solid rock of the mountain. It was natural stone. It was earth. Juno unlaced her boots and kicked them aside. She needed her bare feet flat against the tile to establish a connection. A sudden, sharp drop in temperature hit the room. Juno's breath plumed into white mist. Frost crept across the edges of the window pane, spiderwebbing over the clear glass. Outside, clinging to the sheer vertical wall of the mountain, a figure made of dark, swirling smoke appeared. Chapter 12. The Shadow Walker did not knock. The creature slammed a fist against the reinforced glass. The window shattered in a violent explosion of sharp shards. Cold wind howled into the bedroom, ripping the heavy curtains off their rods. Juno ducked, throwing her arms over her face as glass rained across the slate floor. The assassin stepped through the broken frame. It looked human in shape, but its edges blurred into dark mist. Tattered black rags hung from its shoulders. Its face lacked features, save for two pale, glowing circles where eyes should sit. In its right hand, the walker held a jagged blade dripping with a dark, spell-laced liquid. Juno scrambled backward. She grabbed the pouch of salt from the table and hurled the contents at the creature. The white crystals hit the mist and sparked, emitting sharp hisses like water on a hot pan. The walker flinched, the smoke wavering for a second, but it kept coming. Juno grabbed the small knife. The walker lunged. It swung the jagged blade in a wide, lethal arc. Juno dodged, dropping to her knees, and slashed at the creature's leg. Her small knife passed straight through the smoke, finding no solid flesh to cut. The walker kicked out. A solid boot connected with Juno's wrist. The impact sent a shockwave of pain up her arm. She dropped the knife. It skittered across the slate tiles and slid under the bed. The assassin raised the dripping blade, aiming for her chest. Juno fell back onto the cold stone floor. She stopped running. She slapped both of her bare palms flat against the slate tiles. She pushed her intent downward, bypassing the polished surface, reaching for the raw, unyielding rock of the mountain holding the stronghold together. A deep hum vibrated through the floorboards. The primal earth magic answered her call. Juno yelled, pulling her hands upward in a sharp, tearing motion. The grout between the heavy slate tiles cracked. Solid stone exploded outward. A geyser of sharp grit, crushed rock, and blinding dust shot straight up from the floor, blasted directly into the Shadow Walker's face. The creature unleashed a horrific, multi-layered shriek. It dropped the jagged blade, bringing its hands up to claw at the stone dust, embedding itself into its pale eyes. The smoke surrounding its body thrashed wildly. The heavy oak door splinters shattered. Gideon burst into the room. He took in the broken window, the cracked floor, and the blinded assassin in a fraction of a second. He did not hesitate. He dropped his iron sword, letting it clang against the slate. His hands curled, the nails extending into thick, lethal claws. He launched himself across the room. He slammed into the Shadow Walker, his immense weight driving the creature back toward the broken window. Gideon grabbed the walker by its tattered collar, his claws digging deep into the mist until they found the solid throat hidden beneath. With a brutal, singular twist, Gideon snapped the creature's neck. The dark mist collapsed inward. The Shadow Walker dissolved into a pile of foul-smelling black ash on the floor. Gideon stood over the remains, his chest heaving. Blood dripped from a fresh, deep cut running across his ribs, staining his dark sweater. He ignored the wound. He turned his amber eyes toward Juno. She sat on the cracked slate floor, her bare hands covered in stone dust, her chest rising and falling in rapid, frantic breaths. The pearlescent glow flared bright on Gideon's throat. "I told you to stay away from the glass." "He didn't use the door," Juno shot back, her voice trembling. Gideon walked over, his boots crunching on the broken glass and shattered rock. He looked down at the blast crater in his floor. He looked at Juno's bare, dust-covered hands. The Truth Hex forced the realization out of his mouth. "That was not charm magic," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "That was Earth." Chapter 13. The winter wind tore through the shattered window frame, bringing a flurry of snow into the ruined bedroom. The temperature plummeted. Juno shivered, pulling her tan canvas jacket tighter around her chest. She sat on the cold slate tiles, her bare feet tucked under her legs. Dust and crushed rock coated her hands. A massive blast crater scarred the floor where she had pulled the mountain's raw power to the surface. Gideon stood over the pile of foul-smelling ash. His chest heaved. Dark blood seeped from a deep gash across his ribs, soaking into the dark wool of his sweater. He did not look at the wound. His amber eyes remained locked on Juno. "That was Earth," Gideon repeated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The pearlescent glow on his neck pulsed, confirming the truth of his words. "You broke solid slate with your bare hands. Charm makers brew tea and bind luck. They do not shatter stone." Juno wiped her dusty palms on her jeans. She grabbed her worn leather satchel, ensuring Nibs was safe inside. The mouse poked his head out, his fur shifting from stark white back to a nervous, flickering orange. "I used a localized pressure hex," Juno lied, her voice steady. Nibs flared a blinding neon orange. The small trader illuminated the dark canvas of her jacket. Gideon let out a harsh, dry laugh. He winced, a spasm of pain crossing his face as the spell-laced cut burned his flesh. "Your familiar tells a different story. You hide a primal power, witch. The Coven hunts Earth Speakers. No wonder you live in the slums." Juno stood up, her bare feet stinging against the freezing slate. "We have bigger problems than my magic right now. You are bleeding. Lycans heal in seconds, but that cut is still open." Gideon looked down at his ribs. The edges of the wound looked black, infected with the Shadow Walker's toxic magic. "The blade carried a rot spell. It stalls the healing. We cannot stay here. The door is useless." He pointed a heavy finger toward the entrance. The heavy oak door hung in jagged splinters, broken off its hinges when he burst inside. The corridor outside buzzed with shouting guards and the clatter of boots. Gideon crossed the room, his boots crunching over broken glass. He bent down near the bed and scooped up Juno's boots. He tossed them at her feet. "Put them on," he commanded. He grabbed his dropped iron sword from the floor. "We move to the central bathhouse. The walls there hold iron core stone. No shadows pass through iron." Juno shoved her cold feet into her boots and tied the laces tight. She crouched near the edge of the bed and felt around the dust-covered floor. Her fingers brushed the hilt of her small knife. She slid the blade back into her satchel, right next to the small pouch of salt and the torn gold button. Gideon did not wait. He stepped through the splintered doorway. Juno followed. 2 guards in heavy armor stood in the hall, their faces pale as they looked at the king's bleeding side. "Secure this wing," Gideon ordered. "Shoot anything that moves in the shadows." They walked down the long, torch-lit corridor. The stronghold felt like a disturbed hornet's nest. Lycan soldiers ran past them, carrying heavy iron crossbows and iron-tipped spears. Gideon's pace remained relentless, but Juno noticed a slight drag in his step. The dark stain on his sweater spread further, reaching his waist. The rot spell was eating away at his endurance. They reached a set of massive, double iron doors at the end of the hall. Gideon pressed his heavy signet ring against a recessed groove in the metal. The doors clicked and swung open, revealing a vast, cavernous room filled with thick steam and the scent of eucalyptus. Gideon shoved the doors shut behind them. A heavy crossbar slammed into place, locking them inside. The heat in the room felt oppressive, a sharp contrast to the freezing bedroom. A large sunken tub took up the center of the slate floor, filled with steaming water fed from natural mountain springs. Gideon dropped his iron sword on a stone bench, his knees buckled for a fraction of a second. He caught himself on the edge of the stone basin, his knuckles turning white. "The rot is spreading," Gideon grunted. He reached down and gripped the hem of his ruined sweater. With a single, brutal pull, he ripped the wool over his head and threw the blood-soaked garment into a corner. Juno stared. Gideon's torso was a landscape of hard muscle and old scars, but the new wound commanded all her attention. The gash across his ribs looked angry. Black veins spiderwebbed outward from the cut, pulsing with dark magic. "You need a healer," Juno said, dropping her satchel onto the bench. "My healers use herbs and pressure," Gideon rasped, his amber eyes burning into hers. "They cannot extract coven magic. If the rot reaches my heart, my wolf dies." Juno unclasped her tan jacket. The heat of the room demanded it. She tossed the jacket next to the sword. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the small leather pouch of salt. "Sit down," Juno ordered, pointing to the stone bench. Gideon raised an eyebrow, a smirk fighting through the pain. "You give orders now, witch?" "Sit," she repeated, her voice leaving no room for argument, "before you bleed out on this floor." Chapter 14. Gideon lowered his massive frame onto the stone bench. The steam in the bathing chamber curled around them, thick and heavy. The air smelled of damp earth and crushed eucalyptus. Juno stood over him, holding the small pouch of salt. She looked at the jagged cut across his ribs. The black rot pulsed beneath his skin, fighting his Lycan blood. "This is going to burn," Juno warned. "I have endured worse," Gideon replied. His voice sounded rough, strained by the poison. He leaned back against the wet stone wall, exposing the wound further. Juno untied the leather strings of the pouch. Pure, coarse salt filled the small bag. Salt held no inherent magic, but it acted as a brutal cleanser against shadow spells. It stripped away corruption, leaving only raw flesh behind. She poured a handful of the white crystals into her palm. She stepped closer. The heat radiating from his bare chest rivaled the steam in the room. She placed her left hand on his shoulder to steady herself. His skin felt like hot iron. She pressed the handful of salt directly into the open gash. Gideon let out a harsh, guttural snarl. His muscles went rigid. His hands shot out, gripping Juno's hips like vices. His claws extended, digging into the fabric of her jeans, holding her flush against his legs. "Hold still," Juno commanded, her own heart hammering against her ribs. The salt reacted with the dark magic. A foul black smoke hissed from the wound, smelling of rotting leaves and burnt copper. The crystals dissolved, eating the rot away. Gideon's chest heaved. He squeezed her hips harder, burying his face against her stomach as the pain peaked. Juno did not pull away. She ran her free hand through his dark hair, a grounding touch. The black veins retreating from his ribs confirmed the cleanse worked. The dark smoke faded, leaving clean, red blood in its wake. Almost instantly, Gideon's accelerated healing triggered. The edges of the deep cut began to knit together, sealing the skin. Gideon took a ragged breath. The pain subsided, replaced by a different kind of tension. He did not release her hips. He looked up. His amber eyes burned with a primal, focused heat. The steam hung in the air, wrapping around them in a tight cocoon. "The rot is gone," Juno whispered. She tried to step back, but his grip held her in place. "Yes," Gideon rumbled. He pulled her forward. Juno stumbled, her knees hitting the edge of the stone bench. Gideon stood, his immense height towering over her. He backed her up until her shoulders hit the damp, cold tile of the bathroom wall. He crowded her, his bare chest brushing against her shirt. His sheer body heat overwhelmed the eucalyptus. Juno's breath hitched. She looked up at him, her pulse racing. Inside the discarded leather satchel on the bench, nibs turned a blinding neon pink, broadcasting the wild attractions spiking through her veins. Gideon caught the pink glow out of the corner of his eye. A dark, predatory smirk crossed his face. He leaned in, trapping her between his arms, his hands planted flat against the tiles near her head. "Your rat screams the truth," Gideon whispered, his mouth inches from hers. "Stop fighting it." He did not wait for an answer. He crashed his mouth against hers. The kiss held nothing back. It felt like a storm breaking. Gideon kissed her with blunt, possessive force. Juno gasped, and he took the opening, his tongue sweeping inside, tasting of dark coffee and danger. Her hands flew up, tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. She kissed him back with equal ferocity, a chaotic clash of teeth and raw desire. Gideon let out a low growl. He dropped his hands to her waist, lifting her off the wet floor. Juno wrapped her legs around his hips, anchoring herself to him. He pressed her hard against the stone wall, his mouth moving to her jaw, trailing hot, open-mouthed kisses down her neck. Every nerve in her body sparked. The cold tile against her back clashed with the burning heat of his skin. She wanted him. She wanted the king, the chaos, and the fire. Gideon's teeth grazed her collarbone, right over her pulse point. The Lycan-claiming bite, a single mark to bind them together, mind and soul. His jaw flexed. He prepared to sink his teeth in. Then, the pearlescent glow flared bright across his throat. The moon ash hex pulsed, a stark reminder of the magic running through his blood. Gideon froze. He pulled his face away from her neck, his chest heaving. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes squeezed shut. He fought for control, the muscles in his arms shaking from the effort. "No," Gideon rasped, his voice a harsh scrape of sound. Juno opened her eyes, her lips bruised and swollen. "Gideon." He set her feet back on the floor, stepping back. He kept his hands on her shoulders, keeping her close, but the distance felt like a chasm. The Truth Hex forced the words from his mouth, brutal and honest. "I want you in my bed. I want to mark you as mine until every wolf in this territory knows your scent," Gideon said, his amber eyes blazing. "But I will not claim you while this hex burns in my veins. When I take you, you will have the choice to say no. I will not let magic decide my queen." Juno stared at him, her chest rising and falling. The chaotic witch and the dominant king held apart by her own spell. Chapter 15. The rest of the night dragged on in agonizing silence. Gideon refused to leave the central bathhouse. He insisted the thick iron doors provided the best defense against any remaining shadow walkers. He dragged a pile of thick, heavy furs from a storage closet and built a makeshift bed on the heated slate floor near the sunken tub. Juno sat on the edge of the furs, her knees pulled up to her chest. She watched the steam roll off the surface of the hot water. The physical ache of their interrupted kiss still hummed in her blood. Her lips felt sensitive, and the phantom heat of Gideon's hands burned against her waist. Gideon sat across from her, his back resting against the cold stone wall. He had found a clean linen shirt in the closet and pulled it over his broad shoulders. The deep cut on his ribs had healed into a thick, pale scar, thanks to his Lycan blood and Juno's salt cleanse. He kept his iron sword resting across his knees, his amber eyes scanning the shadows. Between them, resting on the slate floor, sat Nibs. The white mouse was no longer white. He glowed a steady, radiant pink. The color cast a soft, embarrassing neon light over the immediate area. Nibs looked entirely unbothered by the tension in the room. He sat on his hind legs, nibbling on a piece of dried fruit Juno had given him from her satchel. Juno glared at the mouse. "Stop that!" Nibs twitched his whiskers and continued chewing, his pink fur shimmering brighter. Gideon let out a low, amused huff. The sound broke the heavy silence. "The rat holds his ground. I respect that." "He is a menace," Juno muttered, burying her face in her arms, "and he lacks any sense of self-preservation." "He reflects your heart," Gideon pointed out. The pearlescent glow flared on his neck, pushing the truth out. "And knowing that you want me just as much as I want you makes this waiting a unique kind of torture." Juno lifted her head. She looked at the king, sitting in the damp bathhouse like a guard dog. The arrogance that defined him in her shop felt different now. It felt protective. "If Sloane discovers I am an Earth Speaker, she will not stop," Juno said, shifting the topic away from the glaring pink mouse. "The Coven fears primal magic. They claim it disrupts the balance. In truth, they fear anything they cannot control." Gideon tapped his heavy iron signet ring against the flat blade of his sword. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythmic sound echoed off the high, vaulted ceiling. "My wolves do not fear Earth Speakers," Gideon stated. "We revere the Earth. It gives us our strength. If you stand with me, the pack will shield you. They will tear the Coven apart before they let Sloane touch you." "They don't know me," Juno argued. She pulled her worn leather satchel closer, checking the contents by habit. The torn gold button sat heavy in the bottom. "They see a human charm maker who ruined a peace treaty. If you parade me in front of the Alphas, they will demand my head." "Let them demand," Gideon growled. His amber eyes hardened. "I rule the North. I do not ask permission to claim my territory or my mate. Tomorrow night is the Blood Moon Ball. The pack leaders will gather in the Great Hall to demand answers about the broken wedding." Juno's stomach dropped. "You still plan to hold the ball after an assassination attempt?" "Canceling shows weakness," Gideon replied, his voice absolute. "Hiding behind locked doors tells Sloane her tactics work. We open the doors. We pour the wine. We show the Coven that the Lycan King does not bleed easily." He leaned forward, the linen shirt pulling taut across his chest. The silver glow pulsed bright at his throat. "And you will stand beside me," Gideon commanded. "Not as a prisoner, not as a charm maker. You will stand by my side, and I will dare anyone in that room to question my choice." Juno stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. He intended to declare her his own, right in front of the most dangerous wolves in the territory. It was reckless. It was chaotic. Nibs swallowed his dried fruit and let out a tiny burp. The mouse turned an even brighter shade of neon pink, vibrating with second-hand adrenaline. Juno let out a long, exhausted breath. She looked at the glowing mouse, then back at Gideon. The fear of discovery warred with a fierce, burning thrill. She had spent her entire life hiding her power, hiding her scent, and keeping her head down. Now, the most lethal man in the city wanted to drag her into the light. "Fine," Juno said, her voice steady. "But if a pack leader tries to bite my head off, I am breaking his legs." Gideon smiled. It was a dark, feral expression that promised absolute violence. "I would expect nothing less, witch." Chapter 16. The morning broke with a fragile, icy calm over the jagged mountains. Gideon and Juno left the secure bathhouse after the guard captains reported the Stronghold clear. The dead Shadow Walker's ashes had been swept into the wind. Juno's ruined bedroom remained sealed off behind a temporary barricade, the broken oak door replaced by a heavy iron grate. Gideon relocated them to a massive suite on the top floor, usually reserved for visiting alphas. The room featured thick, reinforced glass windows, a sturdy lock, and another sterile, modern gas fireplace. Juno flipped the switch on the wall. The mechanical click echoed, and the blue-orange flames jumped to life, offering heat but no soul. Gideon stood by a heavy oak table, reviewing maps with his scarred guard captain, Brant. Juno sat in a leather armchair near the hearth, drinking bitter black tea. Nibs sat on her knee, his fur finally returning to a calm, snow-white color. The perimeter wards hold, Brant reported, pointing a thick finger at a topographical map. The Shadow Walker slipped through using a blood tie. We found a dead raven near the southern gate. The bird carried a piece of violet silk. Sloane used her own dress to bypass the shield, Gideon concluded. He traced his iron signet ring over the mountain pass. She is desperate. Increase the border patrols. A sudden sharp thud hit the reinforced window. Juno jumped, spilling hot tea on her jeans. Nib scrambled into the pocket of her tan canvas jacket. Gideon drew his iron sword in a flash of motion, placing himself between Juno and the glass. Outside on the stone ledge sat a massive, unnaturally black raven. Its feathers looked slick, like spilled oil. The bird did not blink. It tapped its thick beak against the glass, a rhythmic, demanding sound. "Do not open it," Brant warned, reaching for a heavy iron dagger at his belt. "It cannot enter without an invitation," Gideon stated. His eyes locked on the dark bird. "But it carries a message." Gideon stepped up to the thick glass. The pearlescent glow of the Truth Hex flared on his neck. "Speak, scavenger," he commanded. The raven opened its beak. A voice spilled out, not a squawk, but the sharp, cruel tone of the High Witch. Sloane's voice vibrated through the reinforced glass, carrying dark magic that made the hairs on Juno's arms stand up. "You hide a thief in your halls, Gideon," Sloane's voice echoed. "You broke a sacred vow for a street rat. The council demands justice. You have until the moon reaches its peak tonight to hand the girl over to the border guard. If she crosses the line, the treaty stands. If you refuse, the coven marches. We will rain fire on your stone walls until nothing remains but ash." The raven snapped its beak shut. Its dead, black eyes stared at Gideon. Juno tightened her grip on her empty teacup. A cold dread settled in her stomach. Sloane did not care about the Truth Hex or the insult. She wanted a war, and Juno provided the perfect excuse. The Coven army possessed enough raw magic to level the Stronghold, wards or no wards. Brant looked at the king. "My king, the Western packs are en route for the ball. We do not have the numbers to repel a full Coven siege." Gideon did not blink. He stared at the cursed bird, his jaw set in a hard line. He raised his hand, the iron signet ring catching the light. He brought his fist back and slammed it directly into the reinforced glass. The thick pane did not shatter, but the sheer kinetic force vibrated through the frame. The raven startled, launching itself backward off the ledge and taking flight into the gray winter sky. Gideon turned to Brant. The truth dust glowed bright, forcing his absolute intent into the open air. "Prepare the armory," Gideon ordered, his voice a lethal rumble. "Arm the perimeter guards with iron bolts. Tell the cooks to prepare the feast for the Blood Moon Ball. We proceed as planned." "And the witch's demand?" Brant asked, his face tight. Gideon looked past the captain, his amber eyes locking onto Juno. "Tell the border guards that if a single Coven robe steps onto my land, they are to shoot to kill. I do not negotiate with terrorists, and I do not hand over what belongs to me." Brant bowed his head. "Yes, my king." The captain hurried out of the suite, the heavy door locking behind him. Juno stood up, setting the teacup on a side table. "You cannot fight an entire army for me. You will get your people killed." Gideon crossed the room, stopping right in front of her. His commanding presence washed over her. "My people follow a strong alpha. Handing you over proves I am weak. Sloane wants a war? Let her come. Tonight, I present you to the pack. We secure the loyalty of the alphas, and we break the Coven's spine." Chapter 17. The heavy oak door of the top-floor suite swung open. Brant stepped into the room, his combat boots thudding against the slate floor. The scarred captain did not look at Juno. He kept his eyes locked on Gideon, his posture rigid with tension. The air in the stronghold felt different now, charged with a frantic, dangerous energy following the Raven's departure. "The Western pack leaders arrived early, my king," Brant reported. "Alpha Nox and Alpha Hale wait in the Great Hall. They saw the increased border patrols. They heard the alarm horns from the Shadow Walker breach. They demand answers about the broken treaty and the Coven threat. Gideon stood by the heavy oak table. He picked up his iron sword and slid it into the leather scabbard at his hip. He adjusted the cuffs of his clean linen shirt, his expression hardening into a mask of pure authority. The pale scar across his ribs remained hidden beneath the fabric, but the pearlescent glow of the Truth Hex rested just under the collar of his shirt, a ticking bomb. "Tell them I am coming down," Gideon commanded. "They brought their enforcers," Brant warned. "Nox is volatile. He lost a brother in the last border skirmish with the Southern Witches. He wants the peace treaty secured at any cost." "Nox will fall in line, or he will fall to the floor," Gideon said. He turned toward the door. Juno pushed herself out of the leather armchair. She grabbed her worn canvas jacket and pulled it on. She slung the heavy leather satchel across her chest, ensuring the brass buckles snapped shut. Inside the bag, Nibs let out a tiny squeak. She stepped toward Gideon, her boots crunching slightly on a stray piece of gravel tracked in from outside. "I am coming with you," Juno stated. Gideon paused. His amber eyes swept over her. "The Great Hall holds 50 angry wolves. They smell magic on you. They will challenge your presence." "Let them challenge," Juno shot back. "Sloane marked me for death. She sent an assassin through your wards and a cursed bird to your window. If I hide in this room while you fight your own pack over my life, I prove the High Witch right. I am not a coward." The silver glow flared bright across Gideon's throat. The moon ash hex forced his unfiltered truth into the open. "You are reckless. You possess too much fire for your own good, and it makes me want to burn the world down to keep you safe." He turned on his heel and walked out the door. Juno followed him into the torch-lit corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs. Brant took the lead, guiding them down the sweeping stone staircase toward the lower levels of the fortress. The Great Hall was a massive, cavernous space built from black stone and heavy timber. Massive iron chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a harsh yellow light over the polished slate floor. The room hummed with the low, aggressive growls of 50 Lycan warriors. In the center of the hall stood 2 men. Alpha Nox possessed a frame like a boulder, his arms covered in thick, dark tattoos. Beside him stood Alpha Hale, a lean, wiry man with cold, calculating eyes. Gideon stepped off the final stair. The heavy thud of his boots silenced the room. He walked past the rows of enforcers, parting the crowd like a ship breaking the ice. Juno stayed 1 step behind his right shoulder, her hand resting near the flap of her leather satchel. She kept her chin high. "My king," Nox growled, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "We rode through the night to celebrate a wedding. Instead, we find the border locked down and the guards armed with iron. The High Witch sent word to our territories. She claims you stole a street rat and broke the binding." "Sloane speaks the truth," Gideon replied. He did not raise his voice, but the sound carried to the furthest corners of the hall. He stopped 10 feet from Nox. "The wedding is canceled. The treaty is dead." A wave of shocked murmurs rolled through the enforcers. Hale stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You risk a full Coven war. Our storehouses lack the grain to survive a siege. Hand the girl over to the border guards. Let the witches deal with their own trash." Gideon did not blink. He closed the distance, stepping right into Hale's space. The sheer size of the king forced the smaller Alpha to tilt his head back. The pearlescent glow ignited on Gideon's neck, burning like a beacon in the dim hall. "You dare tell me what to do with what belongs to me?" Gideon demanded. His voice dropped to a lethal, vibrating rumble. "I rejected the High Witch because she drains her own people. I took Juno because she possesses more worth in a single breath than the entire Coven holds in their stone temples. If Sloane wants a war, I will slaughter her army and stack their bones at our gates. But I will never hand over my mate." The word hit the room like a physical strike. Mate. Nox opened his mouth to argue, but Gideon grabbed the front of Nox's heavy leather vest. He hoisted the massive alpha an inch off the slate floor. "Do you challenge my claim, Nox?" Gideon roared. Nox stared into the blazing amber eyes of his king. He saw the unfiltered truth burning there. The alpha lowered his gaze, exposing his throat in ultimate submission. "No challenge, my king." Gideon dropped him. He turned to the rest of the silent room. "Prepare for the ball." Chapter 18. Juno walked back into the top-floor suite, her pulse pounding a frantic rhythm in her ears. The confrontation in the Great Hall replayed in her mind. Gideon had called her his mate in front of the most dangerous men in the North. He had claimed her with an absolute certainty that left no room for debate. She walked over to the far wall. The modern gas fireplace still cast its blue-orange flames across the stone hearth. The room felt stifling. She reached out and flipped the wall switch. The mechanical click echoed in the quiet suite. The flames died in a fraction of a second. No embers glowed in the dark, no logs cracked. The hearth became a cold, sterile void of stone and metal. Juno turned around. A large, flat wooden box rested on the center of the massive bed. It had not been there when they left for the Great Hall. She approached the bed. Her tan canvas jacket felt heavy and suffocating. She unzipped it and tossed it onto the leather armchair. She popped the brass latches on the wooden box and lifted the lid. Inside the box lay a gown made of deep blue silk. The fabric shimmered like the surface of a mountain lake at midnight. Beside the dress sat a small, dark blue velvet clutch. It featured a silver-free, polished iron clasp. Juno lifted the gown. It felt light, devoid of the heavy corsets or stiff collar favored. A simple note rested at the bottom of the box, written in sharp, bold ink. "The Queen wears blue." A knock sounded at the door. 30 minutes, my lady," a female guard called from the hallway. Juno did not waste time. She walked into the adjoining washroom. She stripped off her dusty jeans and her worn shirt. She turned on the brass taps, letting the hot mountain spring water fill the basin. She scrubbed the dirt and crushed rock from her hands and face, washing away the remnants of the Shadow Walker attack. She pulled the leather cord from her hair, letting the dark, messy waves fall past her shoulders. She dried off and stepped into the blue silk gown. It fit perfectly, the fabric draping over her curves and leaving her arms and shoulders bare. The long skirt brushed against the tops of her sturdy leather boots. She refused to wear heels. If the Coven attacked the ball, she needed to run or fight, and she needed solid contact with the floor. Juno walked back into the main suite. She picked up her worn leather satchel from the table. She opened the brass buckle. The satchel clashed horribly with the elegant silk gown, and it was too bulky for a crowded ballroom. She picked up the dark blue velvet clutch from the wooden box. She popped the iron clasp open. First, she reached into the satchel and pulled out her small knife. She slid the blade into the velvet clutch. Next, she grabbed the torn gold button featuring the wolf's head, dropping it inside. She retrieved the small leather pouch of salt, now mostly depleted from cleaning Gideon's wound, and tucked it next to the knife. Finally, she looked into the bottom of the satchel. Nibs stared up at her. The white mouse twitched his pink nose. "Get in," Juno commanded, holding the velvet clutch open. Nibs scrambled up the side of the leather bag and dived headfirst into the velvet clutch. He settled among the salt pouch and the knife. Instantly, his white fur shifted into a brilliant, glowing pink. The neon light seeped through the thick velvet fabric, giving the small purse a faint, embarrassing aura. "Stop doing that," Juno hissed, snapping the iron clasp shut. The thick velvet dimmed the glow, but a faint pink hum remained. The heavy lock on the suite door clicked open. Gideon walked inside. He had changed for the ball. He wore a tailored black suit that looked sharper and far more dangerous than his wedding attire. The dark fabric stretched tight across his broad shoulders. He wore no tie, leaving the collar of his black shirt open, exposing the base of his throat. The heavy iron signet ring gleamed on his right hand. He stopped a few feet from the door. His amber eyes locked onto Juno. He took in the bare shoulders, the falling dark hair, and the deep blue silk gripping her waist. The pearlescent glow flared blindingly bright across his throat. The moon ash hex dragged the truth out of his lungs. "You look stunning," Gideon rumbled, his voice dropping an octave. "You look like you belong in this castle. You look like you belong to me. And if another man looks at you tonight, I will tear his eyes out." Juno gripped the velvet clutch. The pink glow pulsed stronger against her palm. Her face burned hot, the heat spreading down her neck. She did not look away. She stepped forward, her boots silent on the thick rugs. "You promised not to bite anyone's head off," Juno replied, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "I promised to protect you," Gideon corrected. He stepped forward and offered his right arm. "Let us go show the wolves their new queen." Chapter 19. Juno placed her hand on Gideon's forearm. Beneath the fine fabric of his black suit, his muscles felt like coiled steel. They walked out of the top-floor suite and into the torchlit corridor. The air hummed with a different kind of tension now. The frantic panic of the Shadow Walker attack was gone, replaced by the primal, heavy anticipation of the Blood Moon Ball. Guards lined the hallways. They stood at strict attention, holding iron-tipped spears. As Gideon and Juno passed, every soldier dropped their chin in a gesture of absolute respect. They did not sneer at the human charm maker. They bowed to the woman their king had claimed. Juno tightened her grip on the dark blue velvet clutch. Inside, Nibs shifted around, his tiny claws scratching against the small knife and the torn gold button. The faint pink aura still emanated through the velvet, but Juno ignored it. She focused on her breathing. She smelled the sharp scent of pine needles, roasted meat, and the overwhelming musk of hundreds of Lycans gathered below. They reached the grand landing that overlooked the ballroom. The space was massive, built from polished slate and surrounded by towering pillars of black stone. Huge iron braziers burned in the corners, casting a warm, flickering light over the crowd. The Western and Southern pack leaders mingled on the floor, dressed in dark formal wear. Waiters moved through the throng, carrying silver trays loaded with dark wine and thick cuts of meat. A string quartet played a fast, aggressive melody from a raised wooden platform near the far wall. The music clashed with the low, rumbling conversations of the wolves. Gideon stopped at the edge of the landing. He looked down at his pack. He did not raise his hand or signal for attention. He simply let his presence bleed into the room. The effect was instantaneous. A ripple of silence washed over the crowd, starting from the stairs and spreading to the far walls. The musicians stopped playing mid-note. Hundreds of heads turned, their eyes locking onto the balcony. The silence became absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. Juno looked down at the sea of faces. She spotted Alpha Nox and Alpha Hale standing near the front of the crowd, their enforcers flanking them. Every eye tracked her. They analyzed the deep blue silk gown. They analyzed the way she stood next to the king. They searched for weakness. Gideon placed his hand over hers, his fingers warm and rough against her skin. He guided her down the sweeping stone staircase. Their boots clicked in unison against the hard steps. They reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped onto the polished slate floor. The crowd parted, creating a wide circle around them. Gideon stopped in the center of the clearing. He let go of Juno's arm and turned to face the alphas. The pearlescent glow ignited on his neck. The moon ash hex flared, ready to force the truth into the open. Gideon did not fight it. He used the magic to amplify his command. "My pack!" Gideon boomed, his voice hitting the far stone walls and bouncing back. "You came tonight expecting a treaty. You came expecting a union with the Coven. I shattered that treaty. I rejected the High Witch because she is a parasite who drains the strength of her own kind." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Alpha Nox crossed his massive, tattooed arms, listening intently. Gideon turned slightly, gesturing toward Juno. "The Coven demands her life in exchange for peace. They threaten a siege. They sent an assassin into our halls. I tell you now, the coven will receive nothing but iron and blood." Gideon stepped closer to Juno. He did not touch her, but his proximity cast a protective shadow over her. "This is Juno," Gideon declared. His amber eyes swept over the silent crowd. "She stands under my direct protection. She is my choice. She is the future of this territory. Look at her closely." The pack stared. The silence stretched tight. "If anyone in this room disrespects her," Gideon continued, his voice dropping into a lethal, vibrating growl, "if anyone questions her place by my side or speaks a single word against her, they will lose their tongue. And then they will lose their head. Do I make myself clear?" Alpha Nox was the first to move. The massive man stepped forward, lowered his head, and dropped to one knee on the slate floor. Alpha Hale followed a second later. The enforcers dropped next. Like a wave crashing against a shore, the entire ballroom fell to their knees in complete, undeniable submission. Gideon looked at the bowing pack. He turned his head and gave a sharp nod to the string quartet on the wooden platform. "Play," he commanded. The musicians scrambled to pick up their instruments. A slow, heavy waltz filled the massive room. The pack rose to their feet, the tension breaking into a flurry of movement and hushed conversations. Waiters resumed pouring dark wine. Gideon turned his back on the crowd. He faced Juno. The lethal king vanished, replaced by a man consumed by a singular focus. He held out his right hand, the heavy iron signet ring catching the light of the braziers. "Dance with me," Gideon said. Chapter 20. Juno looked at Gideon's extended hand. The deep music of the waltz vibrated through the polished slate floor, traveling up through the soles of her boots. The entire pack watched them from the edges of the room, their amber eyes tracking every movement. She could not refuse him. She did not want to. She shifted the dark blue velvet clutch to her left hand. She placed her right hand into his palm. Gideon's fingers closed around hers. He pulled her forward with a firm, steady tug. The distance between them vanished. He placed his left hand on the curve of her waist, his grip anchoring her to him. Juno rested her left hand, still holding the velvet clutch, on his broad shoulder. They stepped into the rhythm of the music. Gideon moved with surprising grace for a man of his size. He guided her across the center of the ballroom, their boots gliding over the smooth stone. The physical closeness hit Juno like a wave of heat. The scent of cedar and steel wrapped around her, cutting through the smells of the feast and the crowd. "You survived the stairs," Gideon murmured, his voice rumbling in his chest. "You did not flinch when Nox stared at you." "I am used to angry dogs," Juno replied, keeping her eyes locked on his. "I run a shop in the lower markets. The drunks look just as mean." Gideon let out a dark chuckle. The pearlescent glow flared under the open collar of his black shirt. The moon ash hex demanded its toll. "You lie to yourself, witch," Gideon stated, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper meant only for her. "You act indifferent, but your pulse beats against my hand like a trapped bird. You feel this chemistry. It burns just as hot in your veins as it does in mine." Juno's breath hitched. She tightened her grip on his shoulder. The velvet clutch pressed against the fine fabric of his suit. Inside the small purse, Nibs reacted to the soaring tension. The faint pink aura flared into a bright, blinding neon glow. The light illuminated the dark blue velvet, broadcasting her absolute attraction for anyone close enough to see. Gideon glanced down at the glowing clutch. His amber eyes darkened. He pulled her closer, eliminating the last fraction of space between them. Her silk gown pressed against his suit. "Your familiar gives you away," Gideon said. He spun her toward the edge of the dance floor, away from the glaring lights of the iron braziers. "He screams what you refuse to say. Tell me the truth, Juno. Tell me you want this." Juno looked up at him. The music swelled, crashing against the high, vaulted ceilings. The fear of discovery, the threat of Sloane's army, the chaos of the truth spell, It all faded into background noise. She stopped fighting the pull. She stopped hiding behind her sharp tongue. "You are arrogant, Gideon," Juno said, her voice steady despite the heat pooling in her stomach. "You drop a hexed ring on my counter, drag me into a war, and trap me in a castle. You ruin my life, and you expect me to thank you." "I expect you to answer the question," Gideon pushed, his hand tightening on her waist. Juno leaned in. Her lips brushed against the shell of his ear. "I want this. I want you. I want the chaos." Gideon let out a ragged breath. The truth hit him harder than a physical blow. His hand slid from her waist to the small of her back, pressing her flush against him. He stopped dancing. They stood perfectly still in the middle of the moving crowd. He looked down at her mouth, the hunger in his eyes raw and unfiltered. "When this hex breaks," Gideon promised, his voice a lethal vow, "I am going to take you to my bed, and I am not going to let you leave for a week." Juno smiled. It was a genuine, fierce expression. "You assume I will let you rest." The neon pink glow from the velvet clutch pulsed in time with her racing heart. The tension between them peaked, a live wire ready to snap. Gideon leaned down, his mouth a breath away from hers. A sharp, agonizing scream shattered the music. Gideon's head snapped up. Juno spun around, stepping back but keeping her hand in his. Near the grand staircase, the crowd parted in frantic, chaotic terror. A pack enforcer collapsed onto the slate floor, his hands clutching his throat. Dark, foul-smelling smoke poured from his mouth. Standing behind the fallen wolf was a woman draped in an oversized gray cloak. The hood fell back. Sloane stood in the center of the stronghold. The High Witch had bypassed the wards using a glamour. She held the silver dagger in her right hand, the metal gleaming with toxic light. "You stole my crown, Gideon!" Sloane shrieked, her voice carrying the power of a dark curse. She raised the silver blade and pointed it straight at Juno. "Now, I take her life!" Chapter 21. Sloane's shriek echoed through the cavernous ballroom, drowning out the last dying notes of the string quartet. The High Witch did not stand alone. From the edges of the crowd, near the massive iron braziers and the heavy exit doors, a dozen waiters and guests reached beneath their formal wear. They pulled away small, enchanted amulets. The glamours dropped instantly. A dozen coven witches stood revealed, dressed in stiff violet silk and dark leather armor. Chaos erupted. Alpha Nox roared, a booming sound that shook the dust from the heavy timber ceilings. He lunged toward the nearest witch, his body already shifting, muscles expanding and bones cracking as his wolf pushed to the surface. Before Nox could close the distance, the witches raised their hands. They slammed their palms together in unison. A thick, noxious green smoke blasted from their fingers, billowing across the polished slate floor. It smelled of sulfur and rotting meat. The smoke hit Nox mid-leap. The massive alpha choked, his shift halting as the toxic air burned his lungs and clouded his vision. The green fog rolled over the dance floor, blinding the pack and causing a wave of coughing and panicked shouts. Enforcers stumbled, their advanced senses overwhelmed by the chemical magic. "The doors!" Gideon shouted, his voice cutting through the panic. "Secure the doors!" It was too late. The witches positioned at the exits slammed heavy iron bars across the wood, locking them from the inside. They chanted a rapid, sharp incantation. A crackling barrier of violet energy flared across the exits, sealing the pack inside their own stronghold. Sloane did not move toward the exits. She kept her eyes locked on Juno and Gideon in the center of the room. The green smoke parted around her, repelled by the dark magic radiating from her gray cloak. She raised her silver dagger, the toxic metal catching the light of the braziers. Gideon shoved Juno behind him. He kept his hand on the hilt of his sheathed sword, but he did not draw it. He needed his hands free to move, and he needed to keep his body between Juno and the High Witch. The moon ash hex flared bright on his neck, pulsing with the adrenaline flooding his system. "You brought a dozen witches into a room of 50 wolves," Gideon stated, his voice a lethal, vibrating threat. "You will not leave this mountain alive, Sloane." "I do not plan to leave until I cut the heart out of your street rat," Sloane spat back. A coven witch broke from the fog, charging at Gideon with a curved blade. Gideon didn't flinch. He sidestepped the attack, grabbed the witch by the wrist, and snapped the bone with a sharp twist. He ripped the blade from her hand and drove the pommel into her temple. She collapsed to the slate floor. Juno gripped the iron clasp of her velvet clutch. Inside, nibs vibrated with pure, stark white fear. The pink glow vanished, replaced by the cold reality of the attack. Juno reached inside and pulled out the small leather pouch of salt. It was almost empty, but it was the only weapon she could use without exposing her true nature to the blinded, struggling pack. Sloane saw the movement. She clicked her tongue against her teeth, a sharp, cruel sound. "You think salt will save you, Charm Maker? I am going to peel the skin from your face." Sloane lunged. Chapter 22. Sloane moved with terrifying speed, propelled by the stolen magic she drained from her own coven. The gray cloak snapped behind her as she darted through the swirling green smoke. She bypassed the struggling enforcers, her eyes fixed entirely on Juno. She thrust the silver dagger forward, aiming straight for Juno's chest. Gideon moved faster. He threw himself into Sloane's path, stepping directly in front of the lethal blade. He brought his right arm up, aiming to deflect the strike with his heavy iron signet ring. Sloane anticipated the block. She twisted her wrist at the last second, alter the trajectory of the dagger. The silver blade missed Gideon's forearm and sank deep into the meat of his left shoulder. A horrific hissing sound erupted as the toxic silver burned through the fine black wool of his suit and hit Lycan flesh. Gideon let out a raw, guttural roar that shook the slate tiles beneath their boots. The impact forced him backward. He hit the stone floor hard, landing on one knee. He grabbed Sloane's wrist with his right hand, his grip like a vice, stopping her from pulling the blade out for a second strike. "Gideon!" Juno screamed. She dropped the empty salt pouch. She grabbed the hilt of her small knife from the velvet clutch and stepped forward, slashing at Sloane's arm. The short blade tore through the gray cloak and sliced into the High Witch's forearm. Sloane hissed in pain. She yanked her arm back, tearing the silver dagger out of Gideon's shoulder. Blood, dark and smoking from the silver burn, poured down his chest. Gideon's jaw locked. His amber eyes flickered, fighting the agonizing pain. The rapid Lycan healing did not trigger. The silver poisoned the wound, leaving it open and vulnerable. He tried to stand, to put himself between Juno and the witch again, but his left arm hung useless at his side. The poison dragged him back down to his knees. Sloane stepped back, inspecting the shallow cut on her arm. She looked at Juno, her lip curling into a sneer of pure disgust. "A root knife? You bring a root knife to a war?" The green smoke in the ballroom began to thin. The pack enforcers, recovering from the initial blast, started tearing into the coven witches. The sounds of breaking bone and feral snarls filled the air. But they were too far away, trapped behind walls of violet energy and struggling against the remaining magic users. No one could reach the center of the room in time. Gideon looked up at Juno. His breathing sounded ragged, strained by the silver coursing through his veins. The pearlescent glow of the Truth Hex ignited, burning brighter than the iron braziers. The magic forced his absolute, desperate intent into the open air. "Run!" Gideon commanded, his voice a harsh, blood-choked rasp. "Get out of the hall! I will hold her!" Juno stared at the Lycan King. He was bleeding out on the polished slate floor. He was offering his life to buy her a few seconds to escape. She looked at Sloane. The High Witch raised the silver dagger again, preparing to step over Gideon's body to finish the job. Juno did not run. She reached into her dark blue silk gown and let the velvet clutch drop from her hand. It hit the slate floor with a soft thud. "No," Juno said. Her voice did not shake. It carried a strange, heavy resonance that seemed to echo from the stone pillars. Chapter 23. Sloane laughed. It was a cold, brittle sound that cut through the sounds of the fighting pack. "You refuse to run? How touching! You will die right next to your king." Gideon strained against the poison, pushing himself up on his right hand. His knuckles turned white against the slate floor. "Juno," he rasped, the truth dust forcing the command. "Leave now. She has too much power. You cannot fight her with charms." "I know," Juno replied. She did not look at Gideon. She kept her eyes locked on Sloane. Sloane clicked her tongue again, raising the silver dagger high. She gathered a ball of dark, crackling energy in her free hand, preparing to blast Gideon out of her path. "A charm maker who thinks she is a queen. Let me show you what real power looks like." Sloane brought the dagger down in a brutal, sweeping arc. Juno moved. She didn't dodge backward. She dropped straight down, her knees hitting the hard slate. She ignored the pain in her joints. She ignored the chaos of the ballroom, the green smoke, and the roaring wolves. She slapped both of her bare hands flat against the polished stone floor. The slate was cold, but Juno pushed past the surface. She reached her intent deep into the foundation of the stronghold, down into the raw, unyielding rock of the jagged mountains. She sought the primal earth, the ancient sleeping power that predated the Lycans and the Coven. She found it. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the floorboards. It was not a sound, it was a physical sensation that rattled the teeth of everyone in the room. The iron chandeliers swung wildly, the braziers flickering. Sloane froze mid-strike, her eyes widening in sudden, stark terror as the ground beneath her boots began to tremble. "What is this?" Sloane demanded, her voice cracking. Gideon looked at Juno. He saw the raw power radiating from her hands, the air around her warping with concentrated energy. The memory of the blast crater in his bedroom hit him. He understood exactly what was about to happen. "Get down!" Gideon roared to his pack. Juno closed her eyes. She pulled the energy up from the mountain core and channeled it directly into the slate floor of the ballroom. She did not use a chant. She did not use a wand. She used pure, devastating will. With a sharp, tearing motion, Juno threw her hands upward. Chapter 24. The polished slate floor of the great hall shattered. The explosion of power caught the witches off guard. The blast tore through the center of the room, ripping up the expensive tiles and exposing the raw earth below. Sloane let out a horrific scream as the floor beneath her vanished. She fell backward, dropping the silver dagger. Juno did not stop. She kept her hands raised, her fingers curled like claws. She manipulated the flying debris, turning the shattered rock into a weapon. A torrential geyser of stone and dust blasted the High Witch, knocking her flat onto her back. Across the room, the other witches were thrown off their feet by the localized quakes. The violet energy barriers blocking the heavy oak doors flickered and died as the casters lost their concentration. Juno slammed her palms back down onto the raw earth. She pushed her intent outward, hunting the High Witch through the dust cloud. The rock responded. Thick bands of solid stone surged up from the cratered floor. They wrapped around Sloane's ankles, her wrists, and her waist, pinning her completely to the ground. The High Witch thrashed, screaming curses, but the stone held firm, a perfect, unbreakable binding forged from the mountain itself. The Coven assassins, seeing their leader captured and their barriers destroyed, broke. They dropped their weapons and scrambled toward the open exits, desperate to escape the wrath of the Earth Speaker. The dust began to settle. The green smoke dissipated, sucked out through the open doors. The great hall looked like a war zone. The center of the beautiful ballroom was a massive, jagged crater. Sloane lay trapped in the rubble, bound tightly by bands of solid rock. The surviving pack enforcers stood frozen, their amber eyes wide as they stared at the woman in the deep blue silk gown. Juno stood up. She wiped the rock dust from her hands onto her dress. She turned to Gideon. The Lycan King still knelt on the edge of the crater. The silver dagger lay a few feet away, abandoned by the High Witch. Gideon stared at Juno. He did not look angry. He looked awestruck. Suddenly, the pearlescent glow on Gideon's neck flared one final blinding time. It burned with the intensity of a dying star, illuminating the jagged scar on his jaw. The massive surge of ancient, primal earth magic had altered the atmosphere of the room. It had shifted the balance of power. It had changed the king's fate. The moon ash hex shattered. The silver glow burned out of his blood, fading from his skin until nothing remained but the pale tone of his neck. The heavy, magical compulsion vanished from his throat. Gideon took a deep, clear breath. He could lie again. The truth spell was dead. He didn't care. Gideon ignored the bleeding wound in his shoulder. He ignored the captured High Witch and the stunned pack. He pushed himself to his feet, crossed the ruined floor, and grabbed Juno by the waist, pulling her flush against his chest. Chapter 25. The center of the great hall resembled a quarry torn apart by dynamite. Thick clouds of crushed slate and powdered rock hung in the air, coating the iron braziers and choking the light. The pristine ballroom floor lay in ruins, replaced by an immense, jagged crater. Gideon held Juno against his chest. His breathing came in harsh, jagged gasps. Dark blood soaked the left side of his tailored black suit, dripping from the silver dagger wound in his shoulder. The toxic burn of the metal halted his accelerated healing, leaving the flesh raw and poisoned. Alpha Nox stepped to the edge of the shattered tile. The towering enforcer coughed, waving the settling rock dust away from his face. His bones popped and cracked as he forced his partial shift back down, returning to his human form. He stared at the crater, taking in the sight of the High Witch pinned to the primal earth by thick bands of solid stone. "Bind her!" Gideon commanded. His voice held no trace of the magical compulsion that had controlled him for days. The Truth Hex was gone, but the authority of the king remained total. "Put iron cuffs on her wrists and drag her to the deep cells. If she speaks a single syllable, break her jaw." Nox did not hesitate. "Yes, my king." The Alpha signaled his enforcers. They descended into the crater, producing thick iron chains from their combat gear. Juno flicked her wrist, causing the thick bands of solid stone pinning the witch to crumble into loose dirt. Freed from the earth, the enforcers hauled Sloane out of the rubble. The High Witch hung limp in their grip, her violet silk torn and her gray cloak ruined, too stunned by the sheer force of the Earth Speaker to fight back. Juno pushed away from Gideon's chest. Her deep blue silk gown carried streaks of gray dust, the hem shredded near the knees. She ignored the captured witches. Panic seized her throat. "The clutch!" Juno said, scanning the treacherous landscape of the ruined floor. "I dropped it right before the blast!" She dropped to her hands and knees on the edge of the crater. She dug through chunks of broken slate and splintered timber. Her fingernails scraped against rough stone. The pack watched in stunned silence as their new queen clawed through the dirt like a scavenger. "Juno," Gideon rasped, swaying slightly on his feet. The poison in his blood spread further with every passing second. "I have to find it," she insisted, throwing a heavy slab of rock aside. A glint of polished iron caught her eye. Buried under a pile of gravel lay the dark blue velvet clutch. Juno grabbed it. She popped the iron clasp open. Inside, Nibs sat trembling. The mouse looked stark white, stripped of any neon pink or orange hues. He let out a tiny, terrified squeak and buried his nose into the small leather pouch that had once held salt. Beside the mouse rested the small root knife and the torn gold button. Juno let out a breath that felt like a collapsing roof lifting off her chest. She scooped the small, trembling creature out of the velvet purse and tucked him into the bodice of her silk gown, placing him right against her skin to keep him warm. She snapped the clutch shut and stood up. Brant approached the crater. The scarred captain held a thick leather weapon belt wrapped around his hands. He bent down and carefully picked up the toxic silver dagger Sloane had abandoned. The thick leather protected his skin from the lethal metal. "The perimeter is secure," Brant reported, keeping a safe distance from the poisoned blade. "The fleeing witches are in custody. What of your shoulder, my king? Our healers cannot draw out coven poison." Gideon looked at Juno. The raw power she had unleashed still hummed in the air. "Clear the top-floor corridor," Gideon ordered Brant. "I do not need a healer. I have a queen." "The poison is being dealt with," Gideon informed Brant, his eyes never leaving Juno. He extended his right hand, ignoring the dead weight of his left arm for now. Juno grabbed the velvet clutch and took his hand, her magic already beginning to stir in response to his touch. Together, they walked out of the ruined ballroom and headed toward the sweeping stone stairs. Chapter 26. They reached the top-floor suite. Gideon shoved the heavy oak door open with his good shoulder. They stepped inside, and he kicked the door shut behind them, throwing the heavy brass deadbolt into place. The suite felt freezing. The hearth sat silent and hollow, the metal burner offering no comfort against the winter draft. Juno did not touch the switch. The adrenaline flooding her system provided enough heat to rival a furnace. Gideon released her hand. He staggered toward the center of the room, his boots heavy on the thick rugs. He reached over his chest with his right hand, gripped the lapel of his ruined black suit jacket, and ripped the garment down his injured arm. He threw the blood-soaked wool onto the floor. His black shirt clung to his torso, stained a dark, wet red across the left shoulder. The black veins of the silver rot pulsed beneath his skin, crawling toward his heart. Juno dropped the velvet clutch onto the heavy oak table. She reached into her bodice and pulled nibs out, setting the white mouse gently next to the purse. "The hex is broken," Gideon said. He leaned against the edge of the table, his amber eyes tracking her every movement. A dark, feral smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth, despite the agony in his shoulder. "I can lie to you right now. I could tell you that I brought you up here just to tend my wounds. I could tell you that I intend to be a gentleman." "Try it," Juno challenged, closing the distance between them. "A lie tastes like ash," Gideon rumbled, his voice dropping into a dangerous gravel pitch. "I prefer the truth. I want to tear that blue silk off you." Juno didn't flinch. She reached up and placed her hands flat against his broad chest. "Then stop talking and do it." Gideon let out a rough growl. He ignored his poisoned shoulder. His right hand shot out, gripping the back of her neck and tangling his fingers into her messy, dark hair. He pulled her mouth to his, crashing their lips together with brutal, undeniable force. The kiss tasted of iron, adrenaline, and pure chaos. Juno opened her mouth, matching his ferocious pace. She grabbed the front of his bloody linen shirt and pulled him closer, her body pressing flush against his solid frame. The heat rolling off his skin combated the freezing air of the suite. Gideon's hand slid down her back, tracing the curve of her spine. He found the hidden zipper of the deep blue silk gown. With a single fluid motion, he pulled it down. The shimmering fabric loosened, slipping off her shoulders and pooling around her leather boots. She kicked the silk aside, stepping out of the ruined gown. Gideon made short work of the rest, his hands trembling with a need that mirrored her own. Juno gasped as his lips left her mouth, trailing hot, open-mouthed kisses down her jaw and across her collarbone. His teeth scraped against her skin, sending sparks of electricity straight to her core. He gripped her waist and lifted her off the rugs, carrying her toward the massive bed in the center of the room. He dropped her onto the thick pile of furs. Juno watched as he pulled the ruined linen shirt over his head, wincing only a fraction as the fabric tore away from the silver wound. His torso was a landscape of carved muscle and pale scars. The black veins of the poison provided a stark, terrifying contrast against his tan skin. On the oak table, Nibs let out a tiny squeak. The mouse settled against the velvet clutch, his fur shifting from white to a brilliant, blinding neon pink, illuminating the dark wood. Gideon followed her down onto the bed, his knee parting her legs. He pinned her wrists to the furs with his right hand, hovering above her, a predator ready to take his prize. "You shattered the earth for me," Gideon whispered, his amber eyes burning into hers. "Now let me shatter you." Chapter 27. The tension in the suite reached a breaking point. Gideon moved with intense, focused hunger. He released her wrists, letting his hand trace the lines of her body. Every touch sent a new wave of fire racing through Juno's veins. She surrendered her control to the Lycan King, letting the storm wash over her. "This will sting," Gideon warned, his voice a low vibration against her ear. He buried his face into the curve of her neck. He found the pulse point hammering beneath her skin. His jaw flexed. He sank his teeth into her flesh, breaking the skin in a deep, precise bite. Juno let out a sharp cry, her back arching off the heavy furs. The claiming bite was not just physical, it was a violent collision of souls. The moment his teeth locked into her, the connections snapped into place. Juno felt the sheer, predatory weight of the wolf spirit rush into her mind. It felt ancient, territorial, and fiercely protective. In return, the bond opened a gateway to her magic. Juno did not need to touch the slate floor. The power lived inside her blood. She channeled the primal earth, drawing up the unyielding strength of the mountain foundation. She pushed that energy straight through the bite and into Gideon's bloodstream. Gideon's body went rigid above her. A harsh snarl tore from his throat as the raw earth magic slammed into the toxic silver poison coursing through his shoulder. The two forces warred beneath his skin. The black veins near his collarbone pulsed wildly, fighting the purge. Juno gripped his back, her fingernails digging into his muscles, forcing more of her power into the bond. She envisioned the rot burning away, crushed by the weight of stone and soil. Foul, dark smoke began to hiss out of the open wound on his shoulder. It smelled of sulfur and death, rising toward the vaulted ceiling. Gideon squeezed his eyes shut, enduring the agony of the cleanse. As the last wisp of black smoke left his body, his natural Lycan healing kicked in with explosive speed. The jagged, poisoned edges of the flesh knit together, sealing tight until nothing remained but a pale, thick scar. The pain vanished, replaced by an overwhelming surge of shared vitality. Gideon pulled his teeth from her neck. He licked the drops of blood from the fresh claiming mark, sealing the bond. He looked down at her. His amber eyes glowed with renewed, unbridled strength. The rot was gone. His wolf was whole. "Mine," Gideon rumbled, claiming her with total certainty. "Yours," Juno breathed back, pulling his face down for another kiss. The remainder of the night blurred into a frenzy of tangled limbs and heavy furs. Gideon set a relentless pace, stripping away the last of her defenses. He was a force of nature, taking her to the edge of sanity and pulling her back, only to push her over again. The cold mountain air of the suite offered no relief from the blazing heat between them. They moved together, bound by magic and driven by raw desire. Juno lost track of time, lost in the heat and the blinding intensity of their bond. Every touch reaffirmed the connection they had forged. On the far oak table, the neon pink glow of the familiar finally began to dim, settling into a soft, steady pulse as the chaos of the night slowly gave way to the quiet exhaustion of dawn. Chapter 28. Morning sunlight pierced the thick glass windows, casting long, bright rays across the top-floor suite. The air remained freezing. The stone fireplace looked cold and useless in the morning light. Juno woke tangled in the heavy furs. Her body ached in the best possible way. The fresh claiming mark on her neck throbbed with a dull, grounding pulse. She turned her head. The spot next to her was empty, the sheets still carrying his lingering warmth. "Get dressed," Gideon said. He stood near the oak table, fully dressed in fresh canvas trousers and a dark, fitted sweater. The pale scar on his shoulder remained hidden beneath the fabric, but he moved with perfect fluidity. He held out a clean, oversized black shirt. Juno sat up, pulling the furs against her chest. She took the shirt and slipped it over her head. The hem fell past her thighs, offering a stark contrast to the ruined blue silk gown lying forgotten on the rugs. She grabbed her sturdy leather boots and laced them up tight. She walked over to the table. Nibs sat next to the dark blue velvet clutch, his fur back to a pure, snowy white. She tucked the gold button and her knife into the pockets of her canvas trousers and grabbed the clutch. She scooped the mouse into her hand, and Nibs scurried up her arm to perch on her shoulder, his white fur a badge of calm against the dark fabric of the oversized shirt. "Sloane?" Juno asked, turning to face the king. "Chained in the deepest level of the catacombs," Gideon replied. He stepped forward, resting his hand on the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the new bite mark. "Her magic is suppressed by solid iron. The surviving witches are locked in the barracks. The threat is over." "And the pack?" "Waiting," Gideon said. He offered his arm. Juno took it. They walked out of the suite and descended the grand staircase. The great hall looked even worse in the daylight. The immense crater dominated the center of the room. Heaps of shattered slate and dirt covered the surrounding floors. The pack enforcers had not bothered to clean up the wreckage. They stood in organized ranks around the perimeter of the destruction. Alpha Nox and Alpha Hales stood at the base of the stairs. Their faces looked battered from the fight, their formal clothes torn. Gideon led Juno down the final step. They stopped at the edge of the raw earth. Brant stepped forward from the ranks. He dropped to one knee, bowing his head. "The perimeter holds, my king. The northern borders are silent. The Coven army did not march." "They have no leader to give the order," Gideon stated. His voice carried through the silent hall. He turned his amber eyes on Nox. "The treaty is broken. The High Witch is our prisoner. Do we fear the fallout?" Nox looked at the jagged crater, then up at Juno. The massive Alpha dropped to one knee, lowering his head in total submission. "We fear nothing, my king. We follow the Earth Speaker." Hale followed suit, dropping to the floor. Behind them, the remaining 50 wolves fell to their knees in perfect unison. They did not bow out of fear of the king's wrath. They bowed in reverence to the power that had saved them all. Gideon turned to Juno. A genuine, unguarded smile broke across his face. He reached out and grabbed her hand, holding it high for the entire pack to see. "I present my mate," Gideon declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I present the Queen of the North." A deafening roar of approval erupted from the pack. The sound shook the iron chandeliers and vibrated through the foundation of the stronghold. Juno stepped off the polished stone and planted her boots firmly into the raw, exposed earth at the edge of the crater. The mountain responded instantly, humming beneath her feet in a deep vibration that mirrored the wolves' call. The chaos of the shop in the lower markets felt like a lifetime ago. She was no longer a hidden charm maker running from the shadows. She was the Earth Speaker, bound to a king who could not lie to his own heart, ready to rule the territory together. The end. Quick favor, don't go anywhere yet. If you thought Zola was brave for kicking the Alpha King out of bed, wait until you meet Juno. She didn't just kick the king out, she threw a hex in his face and wrecked his royal wedding in front of every Alpha in the north. You have to hear this disaster unfold. Click the video on your screen right now. It is purely unhinged.